The morning fog hung thick over Oakwood Cemetery as Frank Miller parked his old pickup truck by the maintenance shed. 6:30 in the morning, same as every weekday for the past 18 years. Frank pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders. October brought a special kind of cold that seemed to settle right into his bones. "Morning," he called out to Pete, the ground supervisor who was already sorting through work orders for the day. Pete looked up from his clipboard. "Got a burial at 2 o'clock today. Plot 342B. Family's coming in from out of state, so everything needs to be perfect." Frank nodded, pouring coffee from his thermos into the cup. "I'll start digging after I check the south fence. Thought I saw some damage yesterday evening." This was Frank's life. Quiet, predictable, respectful. At 53, he'd spent more time among the dead than most people could understand. His wife Darlene used to say he was more comfortable with the departed than the living. Maybe that's why she left 10 years ago, taking their daughter with her to Arizona. Frank didn't blame her. Being a gravedigger's wife wasn't what she'd signed up for. The cemetery was peaceful this time of day. Frank walked the perimeter, checking the fence as the rising sun began burning off the fog. Birds started their morning songs, and the occasional squirrel darted across his path. Despite what people thought, cemeteries were full of life. By 8 o'clock, Frank had gathered his tools and made his way to plot 342B. The section was newer, with fewer trees and more open space. He checked the measurements twice before marking the outline of the grave. The ground was still soft from rain earlier in the week, which would make the digging easier. Frank worked methodically, the rhythm of the shovel hitting earth becoming almost meditative. Dig, lift, throw, dig, lift, throw. After an hour, he'd made good progress, the hole about 3 feet deep. He paused to stretch his back when he noticed the time, nearly 9:30. He'd need to finish by noon to give the ground time to settle, before the service. As Frank resumed digging, something strange happened. A sound caught his attention, faint and easy to miss if he hadn't been working in silence. He paused, shovel midair, listening. There it was again. A whimpering, like a small animal in pain, but not quite. Frank stepped out of the half-dug grave and looked around. The cemetery was empty as far as he could see. The sound seemed to be coming from underground. "Hello?" Frank called out, feeling foolish immediately. Of course no one would answer. It was probably just water running through old pipes, or maybe an animal had gotten trapped somewhere. He returned to digging, but the sound came again, clearer this time. It was crying. A child crying. Frank's heart beat faster. He'd been working here long enough to hear all the ghost stories. Mourners sometimes claimed to hear their loved ones or see figures among the headstones. Frank never put much stock in those tales. Death was final. The dead stayed dead. But this crying sounded real. Too real to ignore. Frank set his shovel aside and walked in the direction of the sound. It led him away from the new section, past the line of oak trees, and into the older part of the cemetery where the headstones were weathered and tilting. Some dated back to the early 1900s. The crying grew louder near a cluster of family plots surrounded by a low iron fence. Frank hesitated at the gate, suddenly feeling like he was trespassing. This was ridiculous. He was the cemetery caretaker. He belonged here. Yet something about the sound made the hair on his arms stand up. It wasn't coming from above ground. It was definitely underneath, like it was rising up through the soil itself. Frank moved carefully between the graves, trying to pinpoint the source. He stopped in front of a small headstone partly hidden by overgrown grass. He knelt down to read. The inscription, "Eleanor Wilson, 1997-2019, forever at peace." The stone looked newer than others in this section. The crying was coming from right below. Frank pulled out his phone to call Pete, but stopped. What would he say? That he heard a child crying underground? Pete would think he'd finally lost his mind after years of working alone among the graves. He needed more information before making that call. Frank pulled away some of the overgrown grass around the grave and examined the ground. The dirt around the headstone seemed different, disturbed somehow, though not recently. And was the ground slightly sunken in places? Frank knew every inch of this cemetery, but he couldn't recall this particular burial. Eleanor Wilson, 2019, only 22 when she died. He'd been working here then, but the name didn't ring any bells. The crying had stopped. Frank held his breath, listening. Had he imagined it? Then it came again, a heart-wrenching sob that definitely sounded like a child. And now, something else. Words, too muffled to make out, but definitely a young voice speaking. Frank's hands trembled as he took out his phone again, this time turning on the flashlight to examine the ground more closely. There, along the side of the grave, he noticed something he'd missed before, a thin crack in the earth, no wider than his finger. He leaned closer and a faint breeze seemed to come from it, impossible for a properly sealed grave. "Hello?" Frank called out, his mouth close to the crack. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly. Frank waited, heart pounding in his chest. "Help," came a tiny voice, so faint he almost missed it. "Please help me." Frank scrambled backward, nearly falling over another headstone. This couldn't be happening. There couldn't actually be someone, a child, underground. It defied all logic. He needed to call for help. But who? The police would think he was crazy. Pete would laugh him out of the cemetery. What if he was wrong? What if this was just his mind playing tricks after years of solitude? But what if he was right? What if somehow someone needed help? Frank steadied himself and approached the grave again. "I'm here," he said, feeling strange talking to the ground. "I'm going to get you help. Are you hurt?" "I'm scared," the voice replied, a little louder now. "It's dark. I want to go home." Frank's blood ran cold. The voice was clearer now. Definitely a young child, maybe 5 or 6 years old. "What's your name?" Frank asked, trying to keep his voice calm. A pause. "Lily." "Lily, I'm Frank. I'm going to help you. Can you tell me how you got there?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad put me here. He said I have to stay quiet when people come. But I'm scared." Frank felt sick. This wasn't a ghost or his imagination. This was real. Terrifyingly real. Someone had put a child underground, near or even inside a grave. "Lily, I'm going to call for help right now. I'll stay right here, okay? You're not alone anymore." Frank's hands shook as he dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, he struggled to explain what was happening without sounding insane. "This is Frank Miller at Oakwood Cemetery. I can hear a child trapped underground near a grave. A little girl. She says her name is Lily and that her father put her there." The words sounded ridiculous even as he said them. The dispatcher's skepticism was clear, but she assured Frank that officers would be sent to investigate. Frank gave the location details, then returned to the grave. "Lily, help is coming. I'm staying right here with you. I promise." The small voice sounded so vulnerable, so afraid. "I promise," Frank replied, sitting down beside the headstone. "Can you tell me how long you've been there?" "I don't know." "A long time. Dad brings food sometimes." Frank tried to process this information. Was someone living in an underground space, using the cemetery as cover? It seemed impossible, yet he could clearly hear the child's voice. While waiting for help, Frank talked to Lily, asking simple questions and trying to keep her calm. She didn't know much about where she was, only that it was dark and cold and that she wasn't allowed to make noise during the day. 20 minutes later, 2 police officers approached, looking skeptical until Frank showed them the crack in the earth. When one officer called out and Lily answered, their expressions changed from doubt to alarm. Within an hour, the cemetery had transformed. Police cars, an ambulance, and even fire trucks with rescue equipment filled the normally quiet grounds. Officials from the city arrived to consult old maps of the area. As they investigated, they discovered that the cemetery had been built over part of an old tunnel system from the early 1900s. Tunnels that had supposedly been filled in decades ago. Using ground-penetrating radar, they located a larger space, Beneath Eleanor Wilson's grave, some kind of chamber or room. How someone had found or created access to this space remained a mystery. As the rescue operation continued, Frank stayed nearby, occasionally talking to Lily to reassure her. He couldn't stop thinking about the headstone. Eleanor Wilson, dead at 22. Was there a connection? Who was this child, and who had put her there? By late afternoon, rescue workers had determined it was safe to dig. The family burial scheduled for that day had been postponed, and the entire cemetery closed to visitors. As the first shovel broke ground near Eleanor's headstone, Frank stood watching, his heart heavy with dread about what they might find. Whatever lay beneath the surface of Oakwood Cemetery, Frank knew his life would never be the same again. The peaceful routine of 18 years had been shattered by a child's cry for help, a cry that would lead to discoveries darker than the deepest grave. The flashing lights of emergency vehicles cast strange shadows across the headstones as evening approached. Frank sat on a nearby bench, watching the rescue team work with methodical precision around Eleanor Wilson's grave. The police had established a command center in the cemetery parking lot, and curious onlookers gathered at the gates, held back by yellow tape and uniformed officers. Detective Laura Chen approached Frank with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to him and sat down. "How are you holding up?" she asked. Frank wrapped his weathered hands around the cup, grateful for its warmth. "Still trying to make sense of it all. Any news?" Detective Chen nodded. "Ground-penetrating radar shows what looks like a small room about 8 feet down. They're bringing in specialized equipment to make sure they don't cause a collapse during excavation." "And the girl? Lily?" Frank asked. "Is she still responding?" "Yes. One of our officers has been talking to her through that crack you found. She seems alert but frightened." Detective Chen paused. "Frank, we need to ask you some questions about the cemetery staff." Frank understood immediately. "You think someone who works here is involved?" "We have to consider all possibilities," she said carefully. "Has anyone been acting strange lately? Anyone with access who might have been able to create something like this without being noticed?" Frank thought about his co-workers. There weren't many. Pete, the supervisor, 2 part-time groundskeepers who mostly handled mowing in summer, and himself. Occasionally, they hired temporary help for busy seasons. "I can't imagine any of us doing something like this," Frank said. "But there was a guy, Roy Thompson, who worked here about 3 years ago. Only stayed a few months. Kept to himself, did his job well enough that Pete didn't complain." Detective Chen took notes. "What happened to him?" "Just stopped showing up. One day. Pete tried calling but got no answer. We figured he found better work elsewhere." Frank frowned, a memory surfacing. Come to think of it, he spent a lot of time in this older section. Said he was doing restoration work on some of the headstones, but Pete never assigned him that task. The detective wrote something down. "We'll look into him. Anyone else?" Frank shook his head, then hesitated. "What about visitors? Family members, who come regularly?" "We're checking visitor logs and security camera footage," she replied. "Though, from what I understand, this section doesn't have camera coverage." Frank nodded. The older section had been deemed less vulnerable to vandalism than the newer areas with their expensive monuments. A commotion near the gravesite drew their attention. The fire chief was waving over the detective. Frank followed as she hurried toward the growing excavation. "We found something," the fire chief said, pointing to where workers had carefully removed several feet of earth around Eleanor Wilson's headstone. "There's a concrete slab about 5 feet down with what looks like a metal hatch built into it." Frank peered into the hole. Sure enough, buried under layers of soil, was a flat concrete surface with a circular metal cover, like a manhole but smaller. "This shouldn't be here," Frank said. "There's nothing in the cemetery plans about underground structures in this section." The fire chief nodded. "That's what the city engineer said. Best guess is it's connected to the old tunnel system that runs under part of town. Most of those tunnels were sealed off in the 1960s, but some sections were just abandoned." A rescue worker called up from the excavation. "We can hear the child more clearly now. She says she's in a room with a bed and some toys." Detective Chen exchanged glances with the fire chief. "Let's get that hatch open." The next hour moved in slow motion for Frank. Rescue workers carefully cleared soil from around the concrete slab, while structural engineers assessed the stability of the surrounding earth. They drilled small holes into the concrete to insert fiber optic cameras, confirming there was indeed a small chamber below. Through one of these holes, they established visual contact with Lily for the first time. The rescue team set up a monitor that showed grainy footage of a small room with concrete walls. A mattress lay in one corner with stuffed animals and blankets. Battery-powered lanterns provided dim light. And there, huddled against the wall, was a little girl with long, tangled hair wearing mismatched clothes that seemed too big for her thin frame. Frank felt his heart break at the sight. How long had she been down there? Who would do this to a child? Lily, a female rescue worker, spoke through a communication device they'd lowered through one of the holes. "We're going to get you out very soon. Are you hurt anywhere?" The little girl shook her head. "I'm cold and hungry. Is my dad coming back?" The rescue worker glanced at Detective Chen, who gave a subtle shake of her head. "We're going to take care of you, Lily," the rescue worker continued. "Can you tell us how long you've been down there?" Lily shrugged. "A long time. Dad says it's not safe up there. He says the bad people will get us if we go outside." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Whoever had put this child underground had convinced her it was for her own protection. By nightfall, powerful lights illuminated the excavation site as workers prepared to open the hatch. They'd determined it had a simple locking mechanism that could be operated from the outside. After ensuring the structure was stable, a rescue worker in safety gear prepared to descend. Frank watched from behind the police line, unable to tear himself away despite having been on site for nearly 12 hours. He felt personally responsible for Lily, having been the one to hear her cry for help. When they finally opened the hatch, a stale, musty odor rose from below. The rescue worker disappeared into the opening and everyone held their breath, watching the monitor that showed the interior. Minutes later, the worker's voice came through the radio. "I've got her. She's okay." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the crowd of emergency personnel. Frank felt tears prick at his eyes. The worker emerged first, carefully climbing the ladder they'd secured to the opening. Behind him came Lily, blinking in the harsh lights, her small hand gripping the worker's uniform. She looked even smaller in person than on the monitor, thin and pale, with wide eyes that squinted against the brightness. Paramedics immediately wrapped her in a thermal blanket and carried her to the waiting ambulance. As they passed Frank, Lily's eyes met his, and he felt something pass between them. A recognition, perhaps, of his voice from their earlier conversations through the earth. While the medical team examined Lily, Detective Chen coordinated with other officers to search the underground room. Frank watched as they cataloged items, took photographs, and collected evidence. "Frank," Detective Chen called him over after about 20 minutes. "We found something you should see." She led him to a table they'd set up near the command center. On it lay several items from the underground room. A child's drawing, some toys, food wrappers, and a stack of photographs. "Do you recognize this man?" she asked, holding up a photo. Frank leaned closer. The picture showed a younger man standing next to a cemetery maintenance truck. "That's Roy Thompson, the guy I mentioned, the one who worked here briefly." "Detective." Chen nodded grimly. "We found his wallet and ID in the room, along with these." She showed Frank several more photographs. Most featured a young woman with long brown hair and a gentle smile. In some, she appeared to be pregnant. "Eleanor Wilson," Frank whispered, recognizing the name from the headstone. "We think so," Detective Chen confirmed. "According to the dates, she would have been 22 when she died in 2019. Frank looked back toward the ambulance where paramedics were still attending to Lily. "You don't think—" "We'll need DNA testing to confirm," Detective Chen said quietly. "But based on what we've found, it appears Roy Thompson knew Eleanor Wilson. The timeline suggests Lily would have been born around the time of Eleanor's death." The implications hit Frank like a physical blow. Had Roy somehow hidden a child underground for years, right beneath everyone's feet? Had he created this secret space and convinced the girl the outside world was dangerous? As the investigation continued through the night, more details emerged. The underground room connected to a narrow tunnel that led to a maintenance shed at the far edge of the cemetery property, a shed rarely used and easily overlooked. Roy Thompson had created a hidden entrance inside the shed, allowing him to come and go without being seen. City records confirmed that the tunnel system had once been used for utilities, then abandoned decades ago. Somehow, Roy had discovered this forgotten infrastructure and modified it for his purposes. By morning, forensic teams had collected enough evidence to piece together a disturbing picture. Roy Thompson appeared to have been living a double life: cemetery worker by day, occupant of an underground hideout by night, and with him a child who had never known the world above ground. Frank watched the sunrise from his usual spot by the maintenance building, but nothing felt usual anymore. The cemetery that had been his peaceful workplace for 18 years now felt tainted by the secrets it had hidden. Detective Chen found him there, looking as tired as he felt after the long night. "We've identified Roy Thompson's current address," she told him. "A team is on the way to bring him in." "And Lily?" Frank asked. "She's at the hospital. Physically, she's undernourished but not in immediate danger. Psychologically," Detective Chen sighed, "that's going to be a longer road. She's never been to school, never played with other children. As far as we can tell, her entire life has been spent underground." Frank shook his head, unable to comprehend such cruelty. "What happens to her now?" "Social services will place her with an emergency foster family once she's cleared medically. Then the courts will decide longer-term arrangements." Frank nodded, his mind already forming a thought he wasn't quite ready to express. "You did good work yesterday, Frank," Detective Chen said, touching his shoulder lightly. "If you hadn't hurt her, if you hadn't investigated—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew that Lily might have remained hidden for years, or worse. As the morning shift arrived and word spread about what had happened, Frank found himself at the center of attention for the first time in his quiet career. Reporters had gathered at the cemetery gates and police were still processing the crime scene around Eleanor's grave. Frank looked out over the familiar headstones, now seeing them differently. What other secrets lay beneath this peaceful ground? And what would happen to the small girl whose cries had risen through the earth, finding their way to someone who would finally listen? 3 days had passed since they'd pulled Lily from her underground prison. Frank hadn't slept well since. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the little girl's face as she emerged into the bright lights, confused, frightened, yet somehow hopeful. He couldn't shake the feeling that their connection meant something, that his role in her story wasn't finished. The cemetery had reopened, though the area around Eleanor Wilson's grave remained cordoned off with police tape. Visitors came by in greater numbers than usual, drawn by the news reports about the underground child as the papers had taken to calling Lily. Frank found himself answering the same questions over and over as he went about his work. "No, I don't know how long she was down there. Yes, it was pure chance that I heard her. No, I never met the man they're looking for." The truth was, Frank knew very little about what had happened after Lily was taken to the hospital. Detective Winters had called once to thank him again for his help, but provided few details about the ongoing investigation. On the 4th morning, Frank arrived at work to find a police car parked by the maintenance shed. Detective Winters leaned against the hood, 2 coffee cups in hand. "Thought you might like an update," she said, offering him one of the cups. "And to ask a few more questions, if you don't mind." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. The early October morning was chilly, his breath visible in the air. "How's Lily?" "Physically, she's doing better. The doctors say she's malnourished and has some vitamin deficiencies from lack of sunlight, but no serious health issues." Detective Winters sipped her coffee. "Mentally, it's more complicated. She's never known anything but that room. The outside world is overwhelming for her." Frank nodded, thinking how strange and frightening it must be for the child. "Did you find him, Kevin?" The detective's expression darkened. "Not yet. His apartment was cleared out. Looks like he left in a hurry. We found evidence he'd been living there recently, though. His neighbor said he kept odd hours, was rarely seen during the day." "Cemetery hours," Frank murmured. "Exactly. We think he was coming here at night, using that tunnel entrance outside the cemetery grounds to visit Lily. Frank shook his head, still unable to comprehend the situation fully. Any idea why? Why keep a child underground like that? Detective Winters gestured toward her car. That's partly why I'm here. We've pieced together more of the story, and I wanted to share it with you. You played a crucial role in finding her, Frank. I thought you deserved to know. They sat in the detective's car where she opened a folder containing photos and documents. We've confirmed that Eleanor Wilson was Lily's mother. She disappeared 3 years ago when she was 22. Her family reported her missing, but the case went cold. No one connected her to Kevin Bell at the time. She showed Frank a missing person report with Eleanor's photo, the same young woman from the pictures they'd found underground. According to what we've learned, Eleanor met Kevin when she was working at a coffee shop near the cemetery. He became obsessed with her, but she wasn't interested. When she discovered she was pregnant from a previous relationship, Kevin apparently saw an opportunity. Frank felt sick as the implications became clear. He took her while she was pregnant? Detective Winters nodded grimly. We believe he abducted her and kept her in that underground room during her pregnancy. Eleanor's body was found about 3 years ago in a wooded area outside of town. The case was never solved. Now we know why. And he kept the baby. Franco whispered. Lily. Yes. From what we can tell, Eleanor died during or shortly after childbirth. Kevin buried her in the cemetery. We suspect he falsified paperwork somehow and kept the child. But why underground? Why not just raise her in his home? The detective flipped through more papers. We found journals in his apartment. He believed the world was too dangerous, too corrupt for Lily. He wrote about keeping her pure from the world's influence. Classic signs of a disturbed mind. Frank stared out at the cemetery, the peaceful rows of headstones now seeming like a mockery. How many times had he walked past Eleanor's grave, never knowing the horrors connected to it? There's something else, Detective Winters said, her tone softening. Lily has been asking for you. Frank turned to her in surprise. For me? She keeps mentioning the man who found me. The voice she heard first. She seems to associate you with safety. The detective studied Frank's face. Would you be willing to visit her? The child psychologist thinks it might help her transition. That afternoon, Frank found himself at Children's Hospital, following a social worker down a brightly colored hallway. He'd changed out of his work clothes and bought a small stuffed bear at the gift shop, feeling awkward and unsure what to expect. The social worker, Mrs. Patel, briefed him as they walked. Lily is adjusting, but it's a difficult process. Everything is new to her. Electric lights, television, even windows. She's frightened by open spaces and too many people. We're taking it very slowly. She paused outside a door decorated with butterfly stickers. Just be yourself. She responded to your voice before. Your presence might be comforting to her. The room beyond was small and cozy, designed to feel less clinical than the rest of the hospital. Lily sat on a bed dressed in new clothes, her hair recently cut and neatly brushed. She looked up as Frank entered, her eyes widening in recognition. You found me, she said simply. Frank nodded, suddenly emotional. I did. I heard you. He sat in a chair near the bed, giving her space. Lily studied him with intense curiosity. I brought you something, he said, offering the teddy bear. She took it carefully, examining it from all angles before hugging it to her chest. Thank you. Over the next hour, Frank talked with Lily while Mrs. Patel observed quietly from the corner. He kept his tone gentle and asked simple questions about how she was feeling and what she thought of the hospital. Lily's answers were brief but grew more animated as she became comfortable with him. The sky is so big, she told him with wonder. And it changes colors. It does, Frank agreed. Morning, noon, and night, it's always different. Dad said the outside was dangerous. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Is it? Frank chose his words carefully. Some parts of the world can be, but most of it is beautiful and good. And there are lots of kind people who want to help keep you safe. Like you? She asked. Like me, he confirmed, and like Mrs. Patel, and the doctors, and many others. As he prepared to leave, Lily suddenly reached for his hand. Will you come back? The simple question caught Frank off guard. He looked to Mrs. Patel, who gave a subtle nod. If that's okay with the people taking care of you, I'd like to, he said. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank visited Lily regularly. Each time, she seemed a little more adjusted to her new reality. She'd been placed with a foster family who specialized in traumatized children, but remained at the hospital while legal matters were sorted out. During one visit, Detective Winters joined them, bringing news that Kevin Bell had been apprehended trying to cross the state border. The detective showed Frank a photo of the man, thin and pale with nervous eyes, nothing like the monster Frank had imagined. He's not denying anything, Detective Winters said quietly while Lily colored at a small table across the room. Claims he did it all to protect her, says the world is too corrupt, too dangerous. What will happen to him? Frank asked. He'll face numerous charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, possibly murder if we can prove he was responsible for Eleanor's death. He'll be in prison for a very long time. Frank watched Lily, who was carefully staying within the lines of her coloring book. And what about her? What happens now? That's more complicated, the detective admitted. The courts are looking for any relatives from Eleanor's side who might be willing to take custody. If none are found or deemed suitable, she'll remain in foster care until a permanent placement can be arranged. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about Kevin Bell's troubled past. He'd been institutionalized briefly in his 20s for delusional behavior. After release, he'd drifted between jobs, eventually finding work at Oakwood Cemetery, where the isolated nature of the grounds suited his increasingly paranoid worldview. Police believed he'd discovered the abandoned tunnel system by chance while digging graves. Over time, he'd secretly modified it, creating the living space where he would eventually keep Eleanor, and later, Lily. 1 month after Lily's rescue, Frank received a call from Mrs. Patel. Eleanor Wilson's sister and brother-in-law have been granted temporary custody of Lily, she explained. They live about 3 hours away. They never met Lily before all this happened, but they've been visiting her regularly since we located them. Frank felt a complicated mix of emotions, happiness that Lily had family, but sadness at the thought of her moving away. She's asking to see you before she leaves, Mrs. Patel added. They're picking her up tomorrow afternoon. The next day, Frank met Lily and her aunt and uncle in a park near the hospital, a compromised location, as Lily was still uncomfortable in unfamiliar buildings but had grown to enjoy limited time outdoors. Her aunt, Beth, had Eleanor's same gentle eyes. Her husband, Tom, seemed kind and patient, carefully attuned to Lily's comfort level. They sat on a bench while Lily showed Frank the playground equipment she'd learned to use. "We can't thank you enough," Beth said, watching her niece. "If you hadn't hurt her that day..." "I'm just glad she's okay," Frank replied. "She's an amazing kid." "We'd like to stay in touch," Tom added. "You're important to her. A connection to what happened, but in a good way. You were the first person who hurt her." Frank nodded, touched by the offer. "I'd like that very much." Later, as they prepared to leave, Lily approached Frank with solemn determination. "Mrs. Patel says I'm going to live with Aunt Beth and Uncle Tom now," she said. "They have a house with windows and a backyard." "That sounds wonderful," Frank said, kneeling to her level. "It's far away." Lily's brow furrowed with concern. "Will you forget about me?" Frank felt his throat tighten. "Never. Not in a million years." She considered this, then nodded with the serious acceptance of a child. "I won't forget you either. You're the one who heard me when nobody else did." As Frank watched them drive away, he thought about the strange chain of events that had brought Lily into his life. For 18 years, he'd worked among the dead, finding peace in the quiet routine of the cemetery. Now, because of one moment, one faint cry that most people would have missed or ignored, He'd helped save a life that had been buried beneath his feet all along. The cemetery would never look the same to him again. Neither would the sky, or the trees, or the simple act of walking freely in the open air. Through Lily's eyes, he'd been reminded of the wonder of the world above ground, a world he'd taken for granted until he met someone who had never seen it. 6 months had passed since Lily left with her aunt and uncle. Winter had come and gone, and spring was beginning to touch the cemetery with new life. Frank found himself pausing now and then during his work to check his phone for messages. Beth sent photos of Lily every couple of weeks, small glimpses into her new life. The most recent showed Lily planting flowers in a garden, her face smudged with dirt but smiling. She looked healthier now, her cheeks fuller, her eyes brighter. The caption read, "She says these are for you. She remembers you like blue flowers." Frank didn't remember telling Lily that, but she was right. Blue flowers had always been his favorite. The media frenzy around the case had finally died down. For weeks after Lily's rescue, reporters had camped outside the cemetery gates, hoping to interview the gravedigger who'd discovered the underground child. Frank had declined most requests, uncomfortable with the attention. This wasn't about him after all. It was about Lily. Kevin Bell's trial was scheduled for the summer. The prosecution had assembled a strong case, aided by Kevin's own detailed journals. Frank had been called to testify, along with the various officers and medical personnel involved in Lily's rescue. "You still thinking about that little girl?" Pete asked, catching Frank staring at his phone again. Frank nodded, pocketing the device. Hard not to. Pete understood. The whole cemetery staff had been affected by what happened. They'd all attended mandatory counseling sessions offered by the city, but the true healing came through their daily work, tending to the grounds with a new awareness of the secrets that might lie beneath the surface. "Mail came for you," Pete said, handing Frank an envelope. "From the child services people." Frank opened it during his lunch break. It was a formal letter from Mrs. Patel, the social worker who'd been handling Lily's case. It contained updates on Lily's progress. She was now attending school part-time, working with tutors to catch up on the education she'd missed. She was seeing a child psychologist twice weekly. Most surprisingly, the letter mentioned that Lily's aunt and uncle were planning a visit to town next month and had specifically requested time for Lily to see Frank. The news lifted Frank's spirits. Though he'd kept in touch through photos and occasional video calls arranged by Beth, he hadn't seen Lily in person since she'd left. He found himself counting the days until their visit. When the day finally arrived, Frank felt uncharacteristically nervous. He'd cleaned his small house thoroughly and bought cookies from the bakery Lily had once mentioned looking good during a video call. He'd even purchased a children's book about gardening, remembering her interest in the flowers. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock. Beth stood there holding Lily's hand. The little girl had grown at least an inch since Frank had last seen her, and her hair was longer, pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Frank." Lily broke into a smile, but stayed close to her aunt, suddenly shy. "Hello, Lily," he said, kneeling to her level. "It's really good to see you." Beth smiled warmly. "She's been talking about this visit all week. Tom had to stay back for work, but he sends his regards." Inside, Lily gradually overcame her shyness. She told Frank about her new school, her teacher, Ms. Wilson, no relation to her mother, she clarified seriously, and the cat they'd recently adopted. "His name is Digger," she said, "because he likes to dig in the garden. Aunt Beth says he reminds her of you." Frank laughed. "I'm flattered." While Lily explored Frank's small backyard, Beth updated him on her progress. "The nightmares are less frequent now," she said quietly. "The psychologist says she's making remarkable strides considering everything. There are still triggers, though. Dark spaces, confined areas. She can't sleep without a light on." Frank nodded, watching Lily examine a bird feeder with intense curiosity. "And the trial? Will she have to testify?" "The prosecutor doesn't think so. There's enough evidence without putting her through that." Beth sighed. They asked if she'd be willing to record a statement, but even that's difficult. She still calls him Dad sometimes, you know. It's complicated. He did terrible things, but he's also the only parent she knew for 6 years. Later, as they prepared to leave, Lily handed Frank a folded piece of paper. I made this for you. It was a drawing of 2 people standing by what appeared to be a hole in the ground. One figure was clearly Lily, small with a ponytail. The other was taller, holding a shovel. That's when you found me, she explained. I used to be scared of the shovel sound above me. Now I know it was you, keeping the ground nice for everyone. Frank felt a lump in his throat. This is beautiful, Lily. Thank you. After they left, Frank placed the drawing on his refrigerator, secured by a magnet. Such a simple thing. A child's drawing. Yet it represented something profound. Lily was rewriting her story, transforming her fear into understanding. The sounds from above ground that had once frightened her were now associated with safety, with Frank. The next morning, Frank returned to work with renewed purpose. The cemetery had always been his sanctuary, a place where he found meaning in caring for the final resting places of others. Now it held even deeper significance. As he walked among the headstones, he found himself approaching Eleanor Wilson's grave. The area had been fully restored after the police investigation concluded, though visitors still occasionally left flowers or notes, moved by the story that had made national headlines. Frank knelt and brushed some fallen leaves from the stone. She's doing well, he said quietly, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to a headstone. Your sister is taking good care of her. In the months since Lily's rescue, Frank had learned more about Eleanor from Beth. She had been an art student, talented and kind. She'd had dreams of becoming an illustrator for children's books. She'd been excited about becoming a mother, even though the pregnancy was unexpected. All of this had been stolen from her by Kevin Bell's obsession. Mr. Miller? A voice interrupted his thoughts. Frank turned to find Detective Winters approaching. She looked different in casual clothes, her badge not visible. Just checking some of the grounds, Frank explained, standing. What brings you here? Actually, I was looking for you. She held up a file folder. Thought you might want to know. Kevin. Bell accepted a plea deal yesterday. 25 years, no possibility of parole for at least 20. Frank absorbed this information. So there won't be a trial? No. Spares everyone the ordeal, especially Lily. She handed him the folder. These are copies of some photos we found during the investigation. Eleanor's sister thought you might want them, for Lily, when she's older. Inside were more pictures of Eleanor, happy moments from before her abduction. Her college graduation, holidays with family, an art show featuring her work. Thank you, Frank said, carefully closing the folder. I'll keep them safe until Lily's ready. Detective Winters nodded. After a moment's hesitation, she added, the DA's office suggested creating some kind of memorial for Eleanor. Maybe a scholarship for art students or something similar. They thought you might have ideas since you know this place better than anyone. Frank looked around at the peaceful grounds. I might have a few thoughts. Over the next few weeks, Frank worked with cemetery management and Eleanor's family to develop a small memorial garden near her grave. Beth provided some of Eleanor's artwork, which a local craftsman incorporated into a decorative bench. The cemetery donated the space, and the community, touched by the story, contributed to a scholarship fund in Eleanor's name for young artists. The project gave Frank a new sense of purpose. He'd always taken pride in maintaining the cemetery, but this was different. A way of honoring not just those who had passed, but also those who remained. A way of creating beauty from tragedy. On the day of the memorial garden's dedication, Frank was surprised by the number of people who attended. Beth and Tom brought Lily, of course. Detective Winters came along with several officers who'd been involved in the rescue. Mrs. Patel and other social workers attended. Even some of the medical staff who had cared for Lily joined the gathering. Lily, now 7 years old, helped cut the ribbon to officially open the garden. She seemed both shy and proud of her role. especially when people commented on how much she resembled the woman in the artwork, her mother. After the ceremony, Frank found a quiet moment with Lily on the new bench. "Do you like it?" he asked, gesturing to the garden. Lily nodded, running her fingers over the colorful mosaic embedded in the bench's armrest, a recreation of one of Eleanor's paintings. "Aunt Beth says this is where my first mom is," she said. "But also that part of her is in me and how I like to draw and stuff." Frank nodded. "That's true. And this garden is a way for people to remember her, even people who never met her." Lily considered this, like how people put flowers on all these stones. To remember? Exactly like that. She looked around at the cemetery with curious eyes. "Your job is important, isn't it? Taking care of the people everyone remembers." Frank had never thought of his work quite that way before. "I suppose it is." Later, as the gathering dispersed, Detective Winters approached Frank again. "I've been meaning to ask you something," she said. "After all this is over, after the media attention dies down completely, have you thought about becoming a foster parent?" The question caught Frank off guard. "Me? You have a natural way with Lily, and there are many children in the system who need someone patient and kind." She shrugged. "Just something to consider. The department offers programs for people interested in learning more." That evening, alone in his quiet house, Frank found himself mulling over the detective's suggestion. Him, a foster parent? At 53, he'd long ago given up the idea of having children after his marriage ended. His job, his solitary routines, they'd become his life. Yet there was Lily's drawing on his refrigerator, a simple reminder that connections could form in the most unexpected ways. Perhaps his ability to listen, to hear a small voice when others couldn't, was worth something beyond the cemetery gates. Frank picked up his phone and looked at the latest photo Beth had sent. Lily, in the memorial garden, smiling next to the bench that honored the mother she'd never known. In the background, spring flowers were beginning to bloom, bright spots of color against the green grass. Life continuing, even in a place dedicated to remembering those who had passed. New beginnings emerging from endings. Frank had witnessed this cycle every day for 18 years, but somehow he was only now beginning to truly understand it. 2 years had passed since that fateful October day when Frank first heard Lily's cries from beneath the earth. The story that had once dominated national headlines had faded from public memory, replaced by newer tragedies and sensations. But for those most deeply involved, the echoes continued to resonate through their lives in profound and unexpected ways. Frank parked his truck outside the community center and checked his watch. He was 15 minutes early, as usual. The foster parent training class wouldn't start until 6, but he liked to arrive with time to spare, to settle his thoughts and prepare for the evening's discussion. He'd been attending these classes for the past month, ever since he'd finally called the number Detective Winters had given him. At 55, Frank was one of the older participants, but the social workers had assured him that his age wasn't a barrier. Many children needed the stability and patience that came with maturity. Inside, Frank greeted the other regulars with a nod as he poured himself a cup of coffee. There were about 12 people in the program, all at different stages of the certification process. Some, like Diane, who taught 3rd grade, were almost finished. Others had just begun. Frank fell somewhere in the middle, steadily working through the requirements with the quiet determination that characterized everything he did. Tonight's session focused on helping children with trauma backgrounds, a topic that hit close to home for Frank. As the instructor discussed triggers, coping mechanisms, and creating safe spaces, he found himself thinking of Lily and how far she'd come. Their connection had deepened over the past 2 years. With regular visits and video calls, Beth and Tom had been remarkably generous in keeping Frank involved in Lily's life. "You're family now," Beth had told him simply, when he'd expressed gratitude for their openness. "You heard her when no one else did." After class, Frank checked his phone and found a message from Beth. "Lily's art won first place at the school fair. She wants to show you this weekend if you're still coming for lunch." Frank smiled as he typed his reply. Wouldn't miss it. Congratulations to our young artist. The drive home took him past Oakwood Cemetery, its wrought iron gates closed for the night. Frank no longer worked there. He'd taken a position with the City Parks Department 6 months ago, maintaining the grounds at Eleanor Wilson Memorial Park. The small park had grown from the initial garden near Eleanor's grave, expanding to include a playground and art installation featuring local children's artwork, including several pieces by Lily. The career change had been challenging after nearly 20 years at the cemetery, but Frank found satisfaction in creating spaces for the living rather than tending to the dead. He still visited Oakwood occasionally, stopping by to chat with Pete and check on Eleanor's grave. Saturday morning arrived with perfect spring weather, clear skies and gentle warmth that hinted at the coming summer. Frank loaded his truck with a few items: a wrapped gift for Lily, a set of professional colored pencils he'd researched carefully, a bouquet of flowers for Beth, and a potted plant for their garden. The drive to Beth and Tom's house took nearly 3 hours, but Frank didn't. And he'd made this journey at least once a month since Lily had moved away. The rolling countryside gave him time to think, to prepare himself for the bittersweet mix of joy and sadness these visits always brought. Joy at seeing Lily's progress, sadness at the circumstances that had brought them together. Lily was waiting on the front porch when he arrived, spotting his truck from a distance and running to meet him in the driveway. At 9 years old, she'd grown taller, her face losing some of its childish roundness. But her eyes remained the same, bright and curious, taking in everything around her with intensity. "Frank," she called, wrapping her arms around his waist as he stepped out of the truck. "You have to see my painting. It won a blue ribbon and Mrs. Taylor says it might go to the county fair too." "I can't wait to see it," Frank said, ruffling her hair affectionately. "But first let me say hello to your aunt and uncle." Inside, Beth was preparing lunch while Tom set the table. The house was filled with evidence of Lily's artistic talents. Drawings and paintings adorned the refrigerator, hallway, and living room walls, a marked improvement from the simple stick figures Frank had first received. "There he is," Tom said warmly, shaking Frank's hand. "Good drive up?" "Not bad at all. Roads were clear." Frank handed Beth the flowers. "These reminded me of the ones in your front garden." "They're beautiful, thank you," Beth said. "Lily's been counting down the days until your visit. She has big news." Lily tugged at Frank's sleeve. "Come see my painting first, then I'll tell you the news." She led him to the dining room where a framed watercolor sat prominently on the sideboard. It showed a cemetery, not dark or frightening but peaceful, with sunlight streaming between trees and flowers growing among the headstones. In the foreground, a man with a shovel stood next to a small girl, both looking up at the sky. "It's us," Lily explained. "From when you found me. Mrs. Taylor said we should paint something important to us, and this is one of my most important memories." Frank studied the painting, touched by the way she'd transformed what could have been a traumatic image into something beautiful and hopeful. "It's wonderful, Lily. You've captured the light perfectly." She beamed at his praise. "Now I can tell you my news. I'm going to be in a book." "A book?" Frank looked to Beth and Tom for explanation. Tom nodded. "A child psychologist who specializes in trauma recovery has been working with Lily's therapist. She's writing a book about children who have overcome difficult circumstances and asked if Lily would be willing to share her story." "With my paintings," Lily added excitedly. "I'm doing the pictures for my chapter. And guess what? I get to use a different name, like I'm a character in a story." "She'll be anonymous, of course," Beth explained. "But the author believes Lily's experience could help other children and the adults who care for them." Throughout lunch, Lily chattered about the book project, her school friends, and her cat Digger, who now had his own Instagram account managed by Tom. Frank listened attentively, marveling at how thoroughly she'd embraced life above ground. The fearful child from the underground room had blossomed into a confident, creative girl with a bright future ahead. After the meal, while Lily went to feed Digger, Beth brought up another subject. "The prosecutor's office called yesterday," she said quietly. Kevin Bell is trying to appeal his sentence. Frank felt a familiar tension in his shoulders. On what grounds? Some technicality about evidence collection, Tom said, shaking his head. His new lawyer claims the search of the underground room was conducted improperly. The prosecutor doesn't think it will go anywhere, Beth added quickly, seeing Frank's expression. There's too much evidence, too many witnesses. But they wanted us to be aware, in case it makes the news again. Frank nodded, his thoughts turning to the man who had caused so much pain. Kevin Bell had never expressed remorse for his actions, maintaining until the end that he'd been protecting Lily from a dangerous world. The psychological evaluations had revealed a deeply disturbed mind, warped by paranoia and obsession. Does Lily know? Frank asked. No, Beth replied firmly. And we don't plan to tell her unless absolutely necessary. She's made so much progress. Her therapist says she's starting to process what happened in healthier ways, like through her art. Later, Frank and Lily worked in the garden together, planting the new flowers he'd brought. Her hands were small but confident in the soil, patting the earth around each plant with care. My therapist says I like gardening because it helps me not be afraid of the ground anymore, Lily said matter-of-factly, reaching for the watering can. Is that why you like it too? Frank considered her question. I think I've always found peace in helping things grow. Even at the cemetery, I was caring for the grounds, making sure the grass and trees were healthy. Lily nodded as though this made perfect sense. You're good at taking care of things. That's why you found me when I needed help. That evening, as Frank prepared to drive back home, Lily presented him with a small, carefully wrapped package. It's for your new house, she explained as he opened it to reveal a handmade clay plaque. Since you're moving soon. The plaque was painted in bright colors and bore the words, "Home is where your story begins," surrounded by tiny handprints and flower designs. Frank had mentioned his plans to move only once during a phone call with Beth. He'd been approved to become a foster parent and was purchasing a larger house closer to them, with a bedroom that could accommodate a child. He hadn't told Lily yet, wanting to wait until everything was finalized. Aunt Beth told me you might be taking care of other kids who need help, Lily said, watching his reaction carefully. Kids like me, who don't have their parents anymore. That's the plan, Frank admitted. If everything works out, I think you'll be really good at it. She hesitated, then added, Will you tell them about me? Frank knelt to meet her eyes. Only if you want me to, and only the parts you're comfortable sharing. Lily thought about this. You can tell them how you found me, and how I was scared but got brave. That might help them be brave too. On the drive home, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 2 years ago, he'd been a solitary man with a solitary job, finding satisfaction in the quiet routine of cemetery work. Now he was preparing to welcome a foster child into his home, inspired by a little girl whose cries he'd heard when no one else was listening. The news about Kevin Bell's appeal attempt troubled him, but he refused to let it overshadow the progress they'd all made. Whatever legal battles might lie ahead, the most important victory had already been won. Lily was safe, loved, and thriving. Frank glanced at the clay plaque on the passenger seat beside him. Home is where your story begins. A simple sentiment, but profound in its truth. His story had begun again that October morning in the cemetery, when he'd paused in his work to listen to a sound most would have dismissed or ignored. As he drove toward home and the new chapter awaiting him there, Frank thought about the children he might someday help, children with their own difficult stories, their own fears to overcome. He couldn't save them all, couldn't erase the traumas they'd endured, but he could offer what he'd given Lily: patience, steadiness, and most importantly, the simple gift of truly listening when they needed to be heard. Sometimes, Frank reflected, the most important thing wasn't having all the answers or knowing exactly what to do. Sometimes it was just being present enough to hear a small voice crying out from the darkness and caring enough to stop everything and help them find their way into the light.